So history, cartography, and political geography. At the grammar stage, history is best read as a story. Historical analysis will come later. We use the grammar stage to sort of internalize the basic chronology of the history of humanity, the geography on which it occurs, the major players, the characteristics of the cultures, and so on. So the classical emphasis on primary texts particularly applies to history. With the very young, most primary historical texts are probably going to be beyond their reach. So there you're going to sort of have to rely on children's versions of history or of stories. But by the third or the fourth grade, your kids, they can be working with actual historical texts. They can be reading the Code of Hammurabi or the Magna Carta or the Constitution. They can be reading the translation of the original text describing the martyrdom of Saints Perpetua and Felicity. I had to translate that as a medieval student from Latin. They can be reading Martin Luther King's March on Washington speech. All that stuff is accessible when you've given them the tools we've been talking about. So the grammar school history teacher provides basically 4 tools for helping the student learn how to think historically. So first, we organize history into eras. We sort of give them these conceptual chunks that they can sort of be contextualizing everything. We haven't really decided how we're going to do it, but 5, for example, that you could use is the ancient world, the time of Christ and the spreading of Christianity through the Middle Ages, the age of exploration, the history of the Americas, and then modern times. That could be 5 divisions that you give. And then each grade gets a focus, and by the time the child is through, he's sort of taken a romp through, the framework of human history that in the future will sort of allow him to contextualize historical events. So second, we create a master timeline on which we record the dates that we've been learning throughout the year. And the teacher keeps one of these up on the wall. This is just a tiny little chunk. A real timeline would be like the whole height of your wall by the time you're done. But then the student also puts this into his own notebook. And third, we have big maps up on the wall. The history classroom has got to be very map intensive. That allows us to reference locations. They learn to form their own maps in their notebooks. And then fourth, we make lists. The kids make their own lists of just persons, places, dates, all that sort of thing. And we drill those, just like we've drilled everything in all these talks. But let's look at an example of how this might look with, for example, the first or the second graders. So take the story of Androcles and the lion. Okay? So long ago, on the edge of an Egyptian desert in the Empire of Rome, a slave named Androcles was kept by a cruel master. Okay, so we read the story, and on it goes, and I just sort of want to jump to where the Roman soldiers actually catch him, because he escapes, and then, he takes the thorn out of the lion's paw. You all know this story, I hope. In the city of Rome stood a grand arena called the Circus Maximus, the Circus Maximus, but we would say the Circus Maximus. Sometimes slaves were taken there for punishment. Okay, so blah, 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 the Emperor Tiberius. What I'm trying to show you is just basically, it says, great story, but there's a lot of historical content here. So we read the story. And then we do whatever's necessary to bring the story alive. The kids can use puppets or they can dramatize it, however you want to do it. Sort of the same things we were doing with the literature in the English class. Bring the story alive, however you can. Get the kids active. But then we start, because this is history class, we start to search for the historical clues and we kind of put them to work. So the first thing we do is we make little story discs. These are very easy to make. The teacher can just draw them. That's what I always did because it's kind of fun. Or you can, just find an image on the web. That's what I did here. You cut it out and you get it laminated. And then like the lion, can you see that that's a lion? That's a lion. You would have this little laminated disc. You'd put a little bit of that sticky stuff on it, and they'd get to go plop it in Egypt. So this is the story that they're now associating with Egypt. So we're talking about Egypt. So we're going to review what we know about Egypt. The pyramids, the Nile. Joseph, the son of Jacob, sort of got dragged there as a slave. The baby Jesus was there fleeing from Herod. Moses, fled from Egypt, fled out of Egypt. The Emperor Tiberius, what do we know about him? Make a person flashcard for him. Now, we could point out that the author, who was Appian, he was an Egyptian who lived in Rome. He wrote the story around 40 AD. So we could put on our timeline that Tiberius and all of this was going around 40 AD. Oh, look, it's kind of right around the time of the journeys of St. Paul. So that's sort of, putting it on our timeline, it sort of lets us contextualize it. The Circus Maximus. Well, first we could put that on a story disc for Rome, and we could stick that up on Rome, okay? What was done to the slaves there? What was done to Christians there in the site of Tiberius in the Roman court? I mean, this is very clear about what was going on in the site of the emperor. You can buy these models that you can make of the Circus Maximus. Have the kids make a map of the whole Mediterranean basin because, obviously Androcles had to be taken there. What was he, on a trireme going across the Mediterranean Sea? You could do sock puppets recreating the story of Androcles. So by the time you're done just with this one little book, and usually I think in a history class you might do one of these a week, one little book in a week. And it takes 10 minutes to read it. So it's just you read it and then you work it, which is what we've been doing all along. So by the time we're done, we've got some geographical information about Egypt and Rome. We've got a few dates. We've got the name Tiberius. And we sort of add these to our ever-growing collection of historical facts. And then every week, as we introduce a new story, by the end of the year, we've got story discs all over the world map. We've got 50 different occasions on our timeline. And we use mnemonics when we can to remember these dates. The classic one, 1492, ocean blue for Columbus coming over. And we've got like 50 characters on our famous persons list. Androcles. Everybody should know who Androcles is. So with the usual sort of repetitio and memoratio exercises, the children are going to start retaining some of this stuff. So now a word about maps. Remember I said that sort of teaching grammar without diagramming is like trying to teach history without a map? Political geography and cartography, they really have to go hand in hand with history. So National Geographic, they put out this wonderful cartography series that teaches historical maps, trade route maps, population maps, production maps. And the internet makes these types of maps available by the millions. I mean, if I Google Androcles and the Lion, just the maps that I would find it's just magnificent how easy it is. You can find a map for any period, any story that you're reading, you can find a map for it. So when you're teaching this, one of the first in-class exercises that you're going to do after you do the story discs is that the kids are going to go ahead and they're going to imitate the map model. They're going to draw by hand the Mediterranean Sea. They're going to have to draw that Italy boot. They're going to have to draw the Greek islands. They're going to have to draw sort of where the promised land is. And it's sort of like, it's like the penmanship. That concrete experience teaches them just the shape of our world like nothing else, just drawing those maps. And then they can add details that are sort of relevant. Rome, Greece, Egypt, the Nile, the Promised Land, the Mediterranean. And there's a movement out there called Mapping the World by Heart. I don't know if some of you have maybe heard of this, but it trains the kids to be able to draw geographical regions actually from memory. And it's just a wonderful thing. If somebody says, draw the United States, they actually have practiced doing it and they can do it. And then we also have outline maps that the kids can study and sort of quiz themselves on maybe the 20 important features of that region. And all of this working with maps, it gives the kids, again, a sort of a mental framework of the world around them. And you'll notice there are no textbooks involved here. Sometimes the textbook route seems easier. And in the upper grades at St. Ambrose, we actually do have history textbooks because it's hard for the teachers to try to do this without a textbook. But the fact is, students are often bored by history textbooks because they're usually summaries of the stories rather than the stories themselves. And here's the thing I don't like about them. Modern textbooks, even when when they're brilliant, they show the information brilliantly. At the end of every chapter, they've just got pages of this end matter that has vocabulary lists, dates, summaries, outlines of the main points, key figure lists, at-a-glance sections, and all this stuff. And all this end matter just tempts the kids to just jump to the end and just read that. And more importantly, it robs the students of the opportunity to create all that stuff themselves. They should be the ones doing the synthesis, the organizing those historical events, the pulling out of the dates, the pulling out of the characters. Those activities that the publishing companies do for them, those are key to studying. They should, in fact, they are what study is. Study is not filling in the blanks on a worksheet with a couple of words that you just, search through to find and then you're done with your homework. That's not really studying. The studying is that creation of those, those lists and those pulling out the important stuff and organizing it and outlining it. That's what the studying is. So I feel like textbooks are robbing our kids of sort of those opportunities. Because just think about it. If every history reading was followed up with exercises like this, where the student had to do all that stuff, outline the historical context, list the key dates, list the figures, list the events, along with their significance, pick out 10 key vocabulary words, just imagine how they'd master that material.